Hey everyone, it's Dr. Ramani. Welcome back to this YouTube channel on narcissism and narcissistic relationships and healing from them. And so let's talk a little bit about grief, because grief is a guarantee in a narcissistic relationship. And it definitely happens always alongside radical acceptance. In fact, it's one of the things that makes people afraid of radical acceptance. Let's take this on because I had an interesting conversation about this that I want to share with you. Grief might be the most painful but important part of healing. My friend and colleague, Dr. Ingrid Clayton, said something to me recently that really stuck with me. She had said to me that in her process of healing from narcissistic abuse in her life, and what she sees in her clients' lives, is that grief, just as I see it, right, is a central core theme. But that grief, when it happens, also was a step into reality. And I just want to also give a plug about Dr. Clayton because I'm talking about her ideas here. We have a link to her magnificent memoir in the show notes, and she's also an expert on the fawn response. So definitely you should check out her work. And if I'm going to be plugging Dr. Clayton, I'm going to plug myself. Just a reminder before we talk more about grief, and I talk about grief at length in my new book coming out on February 20th. It's called It's Not You, Identifying and Healing from Narcissistic People. If you're interested in checking it out, the link to pre-order is also down in the show notes. And if you pre-order, you're going to get a bunch of great free stuff. So go check it out. Let's go back to Dr. Clayton's work, okay? She said something so brilliant to me. She said that this idea, grief is a step into reality. And when she said it to me, I sat with it for a moment because she's right. The grief feels awful. And the grief almost always comes right after the radical acceptance. In fact, it's often why people are resistant to radical acceptance. Because as soon as we really do radical acceptance right, as soon as we finally allow ourselves to know what we always knew, what we held in our neurons, our cells, our bodies, that this was a one-way toxic relationship, it was never going to be good for us. We wanted it to be different, but then the dam would break once we accepted, and we would be overwhelmed with a sense of grief. That tidal wave might have been scarier than maintaining the toxic status quo of the relationship. But that status quo is in fact awful. It's almost a fantasy, right? The status quo of a narcissistic relationship is a complex net of justifications, denial, cognitive dissonance, betrayal, blindness, telling fake stories to other people about our relationships, smiling big for the pictures that go up on Instagram, selling ourselves and other people on the idea and the lie that everything's just fine, when in fact we're being devalued and manipulated and dismissed and gaslighted and betrayed and harmed into oblivion. But when we do this, when we fake it, we keep the grief at bay. The grief is held in all these corners of our bodies. And we write it off to other things. We live in that grief haze, but we don't know what it is. What Dr. Clayton is saying in her quote, that grief is a step into reality, is that if you are feeling grief, that means you're doing radical acceptance right. That you are seeing this entire situation of the narcissistic relationship or family or system correctly. And you feel a mix of negative emotions. You feel angry, you feel sad, you feel anxious, you feel fearful, regretful. Maybe there's a tiny drop of relief in there, but those other emotions overpower that. Because the grief means you are seeing a situation that is, in fact, laden with grief. I've been doing this work a long time, and the mistake I made when I was a rookie, working with clients early on these issues, was trying to rush people into the idea that they had to see that these relationships were narcissistic. I was almost proud to show them this simple way of understanding it. But many of them weren't ready to hear it. And more often than not with those clients, I met up with their defensiveness and sometimes even their anger, frankly, rightfully so. They should have been angry. Because in my zeal to prove something to them, I didn't let them settle into safety, to get into a zone, to tell the stories, to feel the feelings, to unpack their responses, and then slowly start to connect the dots on the patterns in these relationships. that these weren't just one-offs, which is something that a lot of people do to themselves in narcissistic relationships. And then on top of that, the narcissistic person does it to them. When we comment on their one behavior, the narcissistic person will always push back with like, oh, everyone makes mistakes. I was tired. I didn't mean it. How are you being so critical about one thing? But that always comes up against the fact that the only way we can stay in these relationships without losing our minds is by sort of dissociating from all of the past errors, sitting in denial and betrayal blindness and whatever combination of things we do to compartmentalize and cordon off all of the bad things. The grief is the recognition that these were not one-offs, but that they are a pattern, a massive, overarching, been there all along, never going to change pattern. And whether we choose to leave the relationships, stay in it, whatever we choose to do, our worlds are never the same. Because once you really see these patterns, and especially when you accept them, you cannot unsee them. Your body won't let you. And when your mind and body start connecting on all of this, you know where you carry it. And the grief, in a way, is that reminder. But, as Dr. Clayton suggests, the grief is sort of the step in. Ultimately, that there is no quick fix. There's no tidy little relationship book and being sure you express gratitude to the person you love 5 times a day or have date nights. When we feel the grief, we are being shown the reality of the situation. We would not be overwhelmed with such a primal sense of loss, especially when it involves parents or partners. The feeling of grief that is so deep means that what we are becoming aware of in this relationship meant something bigger than someone doing small ticket stuff like forgetting to pick up towels from the floor or empty the dishwasher or even to listen to you when you talk. It was that this relationship, this narcissistic relationship, subjugated you. It was a relationship in which you were hit with a ton of bricks once you recognized that you were never going to be seen or heard or valued, that you only existed to serve another person's needs, and that no amount of denial or explanation would change that. When you start becoming aware of that, that feeling of grief opens you up to the reality. And reality, folks, is good. Reality is where radical acceptance lives. And while it means giving up on something you may have hoped for, something you wanted, it also gets you out of a circumstance in which you are forever trying to change yourself to create a situation that was never possible. There was nothing you could do to make them treat you better, well, short of doing everything they wanted in perpetuity. But the fact is, they just didn't have the capacity or the want to do so, and what you'd have to do to get them to do that would be a full sacrifice of yourself. Reality means that you see the relationship for what it is. Reality is where you stop trying and in fact recognize how you've already changed yourself in so many ways and learned about how you respond to these kinds of situations and behaviors and patterns. So you can start listening to yourself with compassion and recognize that you were more attuned to the toxicity of the relationship than you ever realized, but you never gave yourself permission to recognize it. Reality is when you take yourself back. But reality is also a loss of innocence, of things you hoped for, of futures you believed could happen, and grief means you are seeing it clearly. The grief can be unsettling without context, but when we see it as the sign and signal that it is, it can be viewed as the beginning of real healing, not the maybe it can still get better illusions, not the I am just going to start thinking more positively distraction stuff, not the I am going to forgive them and start with a clean slate with them. If you are healing from narcissistic abuse the right way, it hurts, and the grief can be overwhelming. But just as we sometimes learn that with some other healing processes or processes of growth, we sometimes know that the hurt actually means that something is healing the way it should. Growth hurts. Ask any kid who grows 4 inches in one summer. Growth hurts. And grief hurts. But grief also means, I promise you, that you are doing this healing thing right. Thanks again.